All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into some seriously strange stuff.
Oh, I love strange stuff. What have we got?
We've got a leaked police statement. Sounds boring, right? But trust me, this thing is anything but a typical report. It's more like reading someone's descent into madness.
Oh, okay. Color me intrigued.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah.
It's all about this supposed cult called the Harbingers.
Harbingers, okay? I'm listening.
And they worship this terrifying entity, get this, called the Great Worm. And the rituals, oh man, the rituals they describe, straight out of a horror movie.
You know, it's amazing how often these things blur the lines between what's real and what could be, just delusion. Like, how do we even begin to separate fact from fiction with something like this?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And that's where you come in. You always help us make sense of the senseless.
I try. But this one sounds like a real challenge. Lay it on me. What's so disturbing about these rituals?
Well, for starters, the person who wrote the statement, they claim they were taken by the Harbingers.
Taken? Like kidnapped?
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe they ran away and joined willingly. They're not even really sure themselves.
Wow, okay, so right off the bat, we've got a questionable narrator.
Right, and then it gets even weirder. They describe these crazy rituals with spirals carved into the earth, chanting, sacrifices, all this creepy stuff. And get this, they swear the spirals glowed with like an unnatural light.
You know, it's interesting, that fear of hidden knowledge, powerful forces we can't see, it's a theme that pops up everywhere. Ancient myths, conspiracy theories, even in our obsession with horror movies, I think it speaks to some deep-seated fear of the unknown.
Yeah, and this statement is definitely pushing those buttons for me. It's creepy stuff. They talk about this great worm and how it influences them. They say they feel controlled, like they hear whispers in their mind. Plus, they had these unexplained gaps in their memory.
Memory gaps. That's certainly something to pay attention to.
They say they escaped the cult 3 years ago, but they're still relying on drugs to, and I quote, keep the whispers down. And they're convinced they're still being watched, manipulated.
This paranoia, it's actually pretty common in people who have been through trauma, especially in a cult setting. From what you're describing, it sounds like the Harbingers use classic techniques of indoctrination and control, isolating their members, breaking them down, replacing their sense of self with the cult's beliefs.
It's scary stuff. And what's even crazier is they're convinced the Harbingers have infiltrated every level of society. Teachers, police, doctors. They think the government might even be involved somehow. They see the cult's influence everywhere they look.
Well, that kind of pervasive paranoia, it can be a lasting effect of being part of a cult. They've been conditioned, almost brainwashed, to see the world in this very specific, very threatening way. Trust becomes impossible for them.
It's sad, really. But is there any truth to any of this? I mean, could this great worm actually be a real thing? Or is it just, a figment of this person's troubled mind, messed up by trauma and drugs?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's impossible to say for sure based on just this one statement. We have to at least consider the possibility that we're dealing with an unreliable narrator. Someone struggling with mental health issues, maybe made worse by substance abuse. They could easily misinterpret events or even create these elaborate stories to cope with their experiences.
So are you saying we should just dismiss this whole thing as the ramblings of a crazy person?
Not necessarily. I mean, even if this great worm is a delusion, the statement is still really interesting. It gives us this window into how belief works, the power of groups, the lasting trauma that cults can inflict on people.
Yeah, I guess there's always something to learn, even from the most out there stories. And hey, maybe there is a kernel of truth buried in this wild tale. History's full of things that were once thought to be impossible, right?
That's very true. I think the key here is to approach this with a healthy dose of both skepticism and an open mind. Let's analyze what we have, consider the psychology involved, and see where it leads us.
Okay, sounds like a plan. So we've established that this leaked statement is, to put it mildly, pretty bizarre. But let's dig a little deeper into some of the specifics that really caught my eye. For example, the speaker mentions these unexplained gaps in their memory, almost like blackouts. They also talk about hearing whispers, feeling like someone or something is watching them. I mean, could these be signs of something more going on? Or are they just symptoms of, the drugs and paranoia we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's tricky. It's really hard to separate those things out. Drug-induced psychosis can definitely cause hallucinations, paranoia, and memory problems. But on the other hand, you have to remember that a lot of cults, they use techniques that are designed to mess with your mind, to induce altered states of consciousness. Things like sleep deprivation, chanting, sensory overload, all all that stuff.
Oh, I get it. So you're saying it's possible that what this person experienced, even if it's exaggerated or distorted in their mind, could still be rooted in some kind of like manipulation they endured while they were part of this group?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at this statement with the whole picture of cult dynamics in mind. We can't just write it off as the ramblings of a delusional mind. We have to try to understand how their experiences in the cult, how the techniques they use, might have shaped their perception of reality, even years later.
Okay, that makes sense. It all circles back to that question of the great worm. Is it just a figment of their imagination, a symbol of their trauma? Or could there be something more to it?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's tempting to just brush it off as fantasy, especially considering how unreliable the narrator seems to be. But, there's always that little part of you, at least for me, that's intrigued by the possibility, however remote, that there might be something more to the story.
I know what you mean. It's like watching a good horror movie. You know it's not real, but you still get caught up in it, wondering, what if? What if there really is something terrifying out there, just beyond our understanding?
Right. Is our fascination with the unknown, with what lies beyond what we think is real. And honestly, there's so much about the universe we still don't understand. Things that would seem like magic or madness to people just a few hundred years ago.
So you're saying we shouldn't completely rule out the great worm?
I think it's less about ruling anything out and more about, like I said before, keeping an open mind, but also staying grounded in critical thinking. We need to look at everything this person says, everything we know about psychology, about cults, about the way belief works, and try to piece together what's really going on.
Okay, so where do we go from here? What's our next step in this investigation?
I think it's time to zoom out a little. Even if we assume, just for argument's sake, that the great worm itself is made up, what can we learn from this case? What does it tell us about the way people believe, the dangers of groupthink, and the fragility of reality?
Those are some heavy questions.
They are. But they're important ones, I think, and I have a feeling our listeners will be eager to hear what we uncover. So, picking up where we left off, this whole thing with the Harbinger's rituals, it's really something else. It gives us a peek, even if it's a distorted one, into what they believe, how they operate.
Yeah, it's definitely intense, the way this person describes them. Like they're these almost hypnotic experiences, chanting, sacrifices, and of course, the spirals carved into the earth. They insist glow.
Right, like with an unnatural light. Yeah, it's wild stuff. But rituals are a huge part of how cults function, They reinforce the group identity, they create a sense of separation from the outside world, and they help instill obedience.
Like brainwashing almost.
Yeah, kind of. It's about exploiting our psychological vulnerabilities, People who are searching for belonging, for meaning, they're easy targets for cults. And these rituals, the chanting, the repetitive movements, the sensory overload, it can induce altered states of consciousness, basically making people more suggestible.
So they're more likely to just accept whatever the cult is telling them.
Exactly. And in this case, what they're being told is that the Harbingers are this all-powerful force. They're everywhere, they're pulling the strings, and ultimately they're working to bring back this great worm.
And the person who wrote the statement, they totally buy into it. Hook, line, and sinker.
And that belief, whether it's based in reality or not, it's incredibly powerful. It shapes their entire worldview, their actions, everything.
It's like they're living in a nightmare. And they can't wake up. They escape the cult physically, but mentally, I don't know, they seem pretty far gone.
That's the thing about cults. They can leave these deep scars, even years after someone leaves. A lot of ex-cult members struggle with things like paranoia, anxiety. They have trouble trusting anyone.
It's heartbreaking. But how do we even begin to untangle all of this? How do we know what's real and what's just part of their delusion?
It's tricky, for sure. We have to carefully examine everything they've told us. Look for inconsistencies, for any patterns that might emerge. Anything that either supports their claims or contradicts them. And of course, we have to take into account all the psychological factors involved, like the trauma, the drug use.
Like solving a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing or might be from a different puzzle altogether.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It takes a lot of careful analysis, critical thinking, and the ability to uphold multiple perspectives at once.
So I guess we can't avoid it any longer. Let's talk about the great worm. Is it real? Just a symbol? Or what?
The million-dollar question, right? Part of me, the skeptical scientist part, wants to say it's all in this person's head, especially with everything else we know about their mental state. But then there's this other part, the part that loves a good mystery, that can't help but wonder, what if?
It's that same feeling you get with a good horror movie, right?
Exactly. It's like, logically it's not real, but there's still that thrill of the unknown, the thought that there might be something truly terrifying out there, just beyond our grasp.
Our fascination with the unknown.
Precisely. And to be fair, there's still so much about the universe we don't know. There are things happening all the time that we can't explain.
So you're not willing to rule out the great worm completely?
I think it's more about staying open to possibilities while also being grounded in reality. We need to look at this person's claims through the lens of what we know about psychology, about cults. We need to examine the evidence or lack thereof.
And maybe, by doing that, we can learn something about ourselves. Even if the great worm turns out to be nothing more than a figment of someone's imagination.
I think you're right. The great worm, real or not, it acts as a mirror. It reflects back our anxieties about the unknown. It forces us to question what we think is real and to grapple with the possibility that the universe is much stranger than we ever imagined.
That's a pretty profound thought. So where do we go from here? What's the next step?
I think we need to shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the bigger picture. Even if the great worm itself is a delusion, there's still some important things to consider. What does this case tell us about the nature of belief? About the dangers of groupthink? About how fragile our sense of reality can be?
Those are some big questions, but I think they're worth exploring. We've spent all this time picking apart this leaked statement, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. But I think even if we never get a definitive answer about the great worm, there's still some important things to think about, some bigger implications to all of this.
Absolutely. I mean, this case, even if we see it as an example of delusion, it really gets you thinking about how belief works, the pull of conspiracy theories, and just this basic human need to find meaning, even when things feel totally chaotic.
This person's belief in the harbingers and this great worm, it's so strong, like unshakable. It literally defines their reality. Everything they see, everything they do comes back to that.
And that's what's so fascinating and honestly a little frightening about these kinds of belief systems. They create this closed loop. Any evidence that goes against what they believe, it either gets ignored or they twist it to fit their narrative. So it just makes their belief even stronger.
It's like you see that all the time with real-world conspiracy theories, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
People just picking and choosing the evidence that supports what they already believe, ignoring anything that doesn't fit. And the more you try to reason with them, the more they dig in.
Exactly. It's like this deep-seated need we have to find patterns, to explain the things we don't understand. We want order. We want things to make sense. And sometimes, I think, that leads us down some pretty dark paths. We cling to beliefs that make us feel safe, that give us certainty, even if those beliefs are totally irrational or even dangerous.
So this statement, this whole case, it's like a warning sign, right? A reminder that we all have biases, we all make assumptions, we have to be critical of what we believe, especially with all the misinformation flying around these days.
I think that's a really good point. It's a call for humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes the stories that grab us the most, the ones that really pull us in, they're the ones that play on our fears or insecurities.
Be skeptical, get different perspectives, and be willing to change your mind when the evidence tells you to. That's important.
Absolutely. And maybe the most important thing of all is to remember that behind every conspiracy theory, every crazy claim, there's a person, a human being who is dealing with their own stuff, trying to make sense of the world in their own way.
Yeah. Even when someone's beliefs seem totally off the wall, it's important to remember that.
Exactly. So I guess the takeaway here is stay curious, stay critical, but also stay compassionate. It's a complex world out there, and none of us have all the answers.
Well said. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today's deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from this bizarre leaked statement to some pretty big questions about belief and delusion and what it means to be human.
It's been a fascinating journey, for sure. A little unsettling, maybe, but definitely fascinating. And I think it's a good reminder that things aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things we want to believe the least.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all of this. The mystery of the great worm, the power of belief, and the shadows that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know. Until next time, stay curious out there.